everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We all have our
Okay, let's
reasons
go ahead
why
and get
we
this
are on this track.
party started, shall we? I had my title wrong. I said I was reading chapter 3. I'm actually getting into chapter 4 tonight. I'm just going to go right on ahead and settle back in here. All right. The Secret History of the World, chapter 4. Lucifer, the light of the world, the apple of desire, a war in heaven, the secrets of the days of the week. Those are the three kind of bullet points of the chapter title. Creation was reenacted in the mystery schools, a drama in 3 acts. The first act dramatized Saturn's oppression of Mother Earth. This was called the Age of Saturn. The second act dramatized the birth of the Sun, S-U-N, and his protection of Mother Earth. This, the paradise time of the flower people, was remembered as the Age of the Sun. During the reenactment of these great events, the candidate for initiation found himself in the middle of what was partly a play with special effects and partly a seance. In an altered state, perhaps drugged and with little ability to distance himself from events, the candidate was guided by the priests on a shaman-like journey through the spirit worlds. Drama as we know it today would eventually move out of the Greek mystery centers to become public performances. But in the early days of the mystery schools, at least, candidates would never have seen anything like this before. We now come to the third act, the subject of this chapter. At the start of it, there is the momentous event we alluded to at the end of the last chapter. Earth and sun separate. From now on, the sun's life-giving rays, rather than illuminating it from inside, shine down upon the earth from the sky. As a result, the earth cools and becomes denser. It becomes less gaseous and more liquid. Excuse me. It shrinks, and the whole of its watery surface is covered by Adam and Eve and their flowery, gently fluttering progeny. Suddenly, at the climax of the third act, the candidate for initiation into the mystery school, watching this drama, would have caught a whiff of sulfur, maybe even been half blinded by a flash like lightning, as the peaceful pastoral scene was invaded by a glistening alien-like form, horrifyingly livid and horned. The picture that was being presented to his imagination was of a snake seemingly endlessly long, millions of miles of it weaving its way into the cosmos. A snake with a perverse kind of beauty. Quote, "Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God," end quote, says Ezekiel 28:13. Quote, "Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, and diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and carbuncle, and gold," end quote. Excuse me. The candidate for initiation would have watched with horror as it coiled itself ever more tightly around Adam's vegetable trunk. He would have understood that what he was watching was the series of events by which life on Earth moved painfully to the next stage of evolution, because the story of the serpent entwined around the tree contains the clearest possible image of the Earth's transition from vegetable to animal life. Since the 18th century, when a matter before mind worldview began to take over from the ancient mind before matter worldview, The church has tried to reconcile the Genesis account of creation with the findings of science. This has been a doomed enterprise because it is based on a modern anachronistic reading of Genesis. Genesis does not consider evolution objectively as a modern scientist does, piecing together bits of geological, anthropological, and archaeological evidence impartially and objectively evaluated. The story of Genesis is a subjective account of the way humanity evolved, what it felt like. In other words, the story of the entwining of snake and tree is a picture of the formation of the spine and central nervous system characteristic of animals as it has been retained in the human collective subconscious. Again and again, we will see that the esoteric account is not necessarily inconsistent with the scientific one. As we suggested by the perspected picture, it views the same facts from a very different point of view. We saw it in the last chapter how matter had, in a sense, prepared the ground in which vegetable life could be born. Now, vegetable life, as it was formed, as it were, formed a cradle into which animal life could be born. To put it another way, vegetable life formed a seed bed in which the seeds of animal life fell. This is the beginning of the momentous episode in history called the Fall. The candidate for initiation would be made to feel the terrible sense of crisis and danger involved in the fall in a quite literal way. Suddenly, and as if impelled by an earth tremor, he found himself falling down into a black hole, pitched into what he immediately discovered to be a snake pit. In the esoteric tradition, the rough-hewn chamber that lies underneath the Great Pyramid at Giza, known as the Chamber of Ordeal, performed just this function. Recent excavations at Baia, I guess that's how you pronounce it, Baia, in Italy, where a system of caves, part natural and part man-made, were believed by the Romans to be the actual entrance to the underworld, have actually revealed the site of a trap door which would have flung the candidate for initiation down into the snake pit below. The candidate experienced for himself how Lucifer and his legions infested the whole earth with a plague of glistening serpents. He saw how, according to the secret history, the whole earth had once begun to seethe with primitive animal life. He saw, too, how desire tormented the very ground, making it heave, and he realized traces of this torment could be seen in expressive rock formations. And then we have two pictures. The first one is Adam and Eve and the Serpent by Masaccio. Masaccio? Masaccio. Okay, let me show you that one, and then I'll bring us back and show and read the caption for the second one. So, Adam and Eve and the snake. All right. And then the second one is titled Renaissance Engraving of the Tree in the Garden of Eden as a Skeleton after Sebald Baharn. Not familiar. Okay, but let's show that one. So the tree of is the skeleton. No serpent in that one. Okay. Okay, so but why should the translation from vegetable to animal life be marked by such torment? The account of the catastrophe in Genesis certainly emphasizes this tormented aspect in some of the most sonorous phrases on the Old Testament. Quote, Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children, and unto Adam he said, Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee. End quote. It seems that as a result of the fall, humans have to suffer, to strive, and to die. But why? Wrapped up in this ancient language are more truths modern science would recognize. Plants reproduce by a method called parthenogenesis. A part of the plant falls off and grows into a new plant. This new plant is, in a sense, a continuation of the old one, which therefore, in a sense, does not die. The evolution of animal life and its characteristic method of reproduction, sex, brought death with it. As soon as hunger and desire were felt, so too were dissatisfaction, frustration, sorrow, and fear. And then we have another picture. The caption for it is Loki, the Norse equivalent to Lucifer, is usually portrayed as a beautiful and fiery god, but also evil, quick witted, and cunning. 19th century illustration by R. Savage. Okay, so I'll show you that one. Loki. Not quite the Loki we're familiar with from the Marvel stuff, but, you know, similar. All right. Who is it who tempts Eve? Who is the serpent who inflames the world with desire? We probably all feel we know the answer to this question, but naively. The problem is that those in charge of our spiritual development have kept us at a nursery level of understanding. We began to see in the last chapter how the church has covered up its astronomical roots, how the beginning of Genesis contains hidden within its stories of the same gods of the plants we know from other more primitive religions. The god Saturn, the earth goddess, and the sun god. As we now move further into the Genesis account of history, we can see again how this covering up of astronomical roots, the radical monotheism of the modern church, can stop us from understanding clearly what the ancient text is trying to tell us. Most people would naturally assume that Christianity allows the existence of only one devil, the devil. In other words, that Satan and Lucifer are the same entity. In fact, we need only a quick, fresh look at the text to see that the authors of the Bible intended something quite different. Again, this is something biblical scholars accept, but which hasn't filtered down to congregations. We have seen that Satan, the Dark Lord, the agent of materialism, is to be identified with the god of the planet Saturn in Greek and Roman mythology. Is Lucifer the snake, the tempter who inflames humanity with animal desire, also to be identified with Saturn, or perhaps with a different planet? There is a vast erudite body of literature comparing biblical text to older and contemporary text with neighboring cultures, which shows that the two main representatives of evil in the Bible, Satan and Lucifer, are not the same entity. Fortunately, we do not need to immerse ourselves in this literature because there is a quite explicit statement in the Bible itself. Isaiah 14:12, quote, "How thou art fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning." End quote. The morning star is, of course, Venus. The Bible therefore identifies Lucifer with the planet Venus. It might at first seem counterintuitive to equate the goddess of Venus in Greece and Rome, Aphrodite to the Greeks, with Lucifer in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Venus/Aphrodite, is female and seems more life-enhancing, but in reality there are key points of similarity. Both Lucifer and Venus/Aphrodite are bound up with animal desire and sexuality. Okay, then we have a couple of pictures. The correlation between Lucifer and Venus can also be seen in the mythology of the Americas, where he appears in the figure of the horned and feathered snake god Quetzalcoatl. I know it's Quetzalcoatl. There are all kinds of different pronunciations for that. Um, pronounce it however the hell you feel like. All right, so there are two separate pictures. I'll show you. So this is Quetzalcoatl, or Quetzalcoatl, whatever. Um, and then This is the other one on this page. I'll have to see if there's another caption for it. Um, Interesting. Not sure. Well, I have my thoughts on that, but anyway. So the snake sometimes found coiled around the body of the goddess was called the minister of the goddess by the Greeks. So that is what this second one is portraying. I'll go back to it real quick. This one looks like the snake coiled. I'm not. Okay. Feel free to pause later on when you go see this on YouTube and look at those for as long as you want. Okay. The apple is the fruit associated with both. Lucifer tempts Eve with an apple, and Paris hands Venus an apple in a gesture that precipitates the abduction of Helen and the great war of the ancient world. The apple is universally the fruit of Venus because if you slice an apple in two, the path that Venus traces in the sky over a 40-year period is a five-pointed star, pinpointed by the positions of the pips. Lucifer and Venus are also ambiguous figures. Lucifer is evil, but he is a necessary evil. Without Lucifer's intervention, proto-humanity would not have evolved beyond a vegetative form of life. As a result of Lucifer's intervention in history, we are animated both in the sense that we can move about the surface of the planet and also in the sense that we are moved by desire. An animal has a conscious awareness of itself as a distinct entity that is denied to plants. To say that Adam and Eve knew they were naked is to say that they became aware that they had bodies. Many beautiful representations of Venus have come down to us from the ancient world, but there were terrifying representations too. Behind the image of a woman of matchless beauty lurked the terrifying serpent woman. In order to delve deeper into this ambiguity and to understand better the next great event in the secret history of the world, we now turn to an early German version of the Venus/Lucifer tradition, which appeared in medieval poetry and would enter the mainstream of world literature when it was taken up and adapted by Wolfram von Essenbach in Parsifal. Okay, and then we have a poem. So I'll quote the poem. See, Lucifer, there he is. There are still master priests, then you know well that I am saying the truth. Saint Michael saw God's anger. He took Lucifer's crown from his head in such a way that the stone jumped out of it, which on earth became Parsifal's stone. End quote. Tradition tells us that as Lucifer fell, a great emerald dropped from his forehead. This signals that humanity would increasingly suffer a loss of vision in the third eye, the brow chakra. And then we have one or two pictures here. I don't know if it'll come up as one or two. And the very long caption is, these small Greek statues capture something of the joy the Greeks took in the pleasures of desire, their joy in the material world. In Greek creation stories, the birth of Venus is brought about by an act of rebellion by Saturn, who takes his sickle and slices at the testicles of Uranos, the sky god, castrating him. As the sperm of Uranos falls into the sea, the beautiful goddess Venus springs into being, fully formed, and floats ashore on a seashell. The ancients believed that shells were precipitated out of water, just as matter is precipitated out of spirit, hence their symbolizing emanation from the cosmic mind, both here and in the iconography of St. James of Compostela. Compostela, whatever. Okay, so it does come up as a single picture. So these depictions of Venus and the shell. Two different ones, obviously. Okay. I don't know why I have a frog in my throat tonight. While the result of the influence of Satan is that life is often hard to bear, it is a result of the influence of Venus that life is often hard to understand. The influence of Venus brought a paradoxical, tricky quality to the heart of the universe. In other words, delusion entered the world. Lucifer endowed matter with a glamour that would dazzle humankind and blind people to higher truths. Why is it that the way forward sometimes looks like the way backwards? Why is it that the thing we most ought not to do looks almost indistinguishable from the thing we ought to do? In my heart of hearts, I know what I ought to do, but I have another alien element entwined inside me that wants to lead me astray. The Luciferic element is infused into my very physiology. Desire and delusion combine in me dangerously because of Lucifer's influence. Quote, the God that I would do I the God the I'm sorry, the good that I would do I the wow, this is a confusing sentence. The good that I would do I not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. I think maybe they're missing a word there or something. Anyway, that's end quote Romans 7:19. St. Paul, who, as we shall see, was an initiate of the mystery tradition, is saying that part of me always knows what is right, but that it is often overruled by a part that is enthralled to Lucifer. Modern science never frames the questions: how did delusion come into the world, or imagination, or willpower? But to the ancients, delusion, imagination, and will were among the greatest forces in the universe, living out there in three-dimensional space as well as in our own minds. For them, the history of creation was an account of how these things came to be. Friedrich Nietzsche said, quote, unless you have chaos inside you, you cannot give birth to a dancing star, end quote. Humans would never have been able to become freely creative, brave, or loving if they had not been able to make mistakes, to see things as other than they are, and to believe things to be other than they are. Because of Lucifer, it is the case that we do not always believe in proportion to the evidence. We can often believe that what we want to believe. For instance, the life of someone we know can appear a miserable failure or a heartwarming success depending on how we choose to look at it, whether good-heartedly or mean-spiritedly. And when the harsh fire, the primeval sulfur burns in the pit of our stomachs, it is difficult for us to choose to be good-hearted. When in the very beginning the earth goddess had been attacked by the god of Saturn, the young sun god had arrived to protect her, and fighting a great battle in heaven, had defeated Saturn. The candidate for initiation, who was being shown the secret history of the world, had therefore already watched one great battle. He now had to watch another one in which the enemy was the great snake that had slithered into paradise in order to corrupt it. Who was to be the new champion to fight this second battle? As with the church's conflation of Satan and Lucifer in order to disguise its astronomical roots, we must now disentangle another deliberately created confusion. In the early chapters of Genesis, it, in the early sorry, let me start that over. In the early chapters of Genesis telling the story of creation, the word usually translated as God is, as we have seen, Elohim. Later, Genesis ceases to refer to Elohim, and instead, the word usually translated as God is Jehovah. Biblical scholars working outside the esoteric tradition have tended to explain what appears to them as two different names for the same God as a result of two different literary strands, the Elohim strand and the Jehovah strand, probably dating from different periods and woven together by a later redactor. However, scholars working within the esoteric tradition have a much simpler explanation. Elohim and Jehovah are not different names for the same entity, but different entities. Elohim is, as we have seen, a collective name for the seven spirits working together as the God of the sun, while Jehovah came into being when one of these seven broke away to defend the earth from Venus. In order to discover Jehovah's true astronomical identity, we must look again at the iconography of his opponent, Venus. We must also remember that for the ancients, the history of the origins of the cosmos was as much about how human experience was put together, how experience gained its characteristic structure, as it was about how the physical universe was put together. In other words, it was as much about the principles of human nature as about the laws of the natural world. Excuse me. Human nature is so formed that any power it may have to resist my animal start that over. Totally misread it. Human nature is so formed that any power I may have to resist my animal desires, indeed what stops me from becoming a mere animal, derives from my capacity for thought and reflection. Venus was traditionally depicted holding a mirror, but not out of vanity as is nowadays supposed. The mirror was a symbol of the power of reflection to modify desire. Okay, and then we have two pictures again. The first one, depicted here on the back of a Greek mirror from the 1st century BC, is the story of Semele, Semele, goddess of the moon, and a beautiful youth called Endymion. In the story, Semele falls in love with Endymion and casts a spell that leaves him in perpetual dreamy sleep. Here is an explicit depiction of the moon working on the pineal gland in the form of the wand of Dionysus. Okay, so I'll show you that picture. The back of the mirror. All kinds of stuff going on. Okay, and then we have another picture here. Medieval depiction of Jehovah as a war god. Okay, pretty crude compared to the last picture. The god of reflection was the god of the greater reflector in the sky, the moon. In all ancient cultures, the moon regulated not only fertility but thought. In fact, the initiate priest believed that in order to create the conditions in which human thought would be possible, the cosmos had to arrange itself in a particular way. In order for human reflection to be possible, the sun and the moon had to arrange themselves in the sky so that the moon reflected the light of the sun down on earth. They also believed that this arrangement in the sky had to be reproduced on a smaller scale inside the human head. There, the pineal gland represented the sun, and the gland which could modify and reflect on the visions that the pineal gland received from the spirit worlds was the pituitary gland. This might seem one of the madder things that anyone has ever believed, but to the ancients it corresponded to their everyday lived experience. They tracked small changes in their consciousness which seemed to them to mutate with the changing positions of the sun and moon. Readers are invited to check their own experience to see whether their dreams are more vivid when the moon is big and full. If you observe oysters, okay, if you observe oysters in a tray for a month, you will see that they wax and wane with the moon. Modern science has confirmed that the pituitary gland behaves like an oyster. The god and the moon the god of the moon would become known to the Hebrews as Jehovah and to the Muslims as Allah, the great god of thou shalt not. So, at the climax of this great cosmic drama of creation, with the earth In danger of becoming a living hell, a new force arose to meet Lucifer, just as the seven Elohim had acted to hold Saturn/Satan in check. Now one of these seven broke away to become the god of the moon, and from there directed operations to hold Venus/Lucifer in check. And we have another picture. Perseus, the wielder of the moon shield. Okay, I don't know who the third person is. Okay. This great cosmic battle against Venus was remembered in cultures around the world. For example, in the story of Krishna's battle with the snake demon Kaliya, and the stories of Apollo's battle with the python, and of Perseus combating the sexually ravenous dragon that threatened Andromeda by using his shield as a mirror. The Jehovah of the Old Testament is a jealous, angry, and warlike God. In Hebrew tradition, Jehovah's forces are led by Archangel Michael, as the book of Revelation has it. Quote, "And there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought against his angels. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth." End quote. We have seen then that in the third great act of the drama of creation, the god of the moon won a great victory. So began the era of the moon. The first three epochs of the cosmos, the mineral, vegetable, and animal eras, Saturn Day, Sun Day, and Moon Day, are remembered in the names of the first 3 days of the week. These days of the week are named after these three heavenly bodies in this particular order for this reason alone. That is actually the end of the chapter, except there is another picture and a caption. Here we see a sun god's battle against a snake or dragon in an engraving taken from the painting by Raphael. So I'll show you that. It's hard to tell what he's battling. Blow that up a bit more and see. Yeah, it's really hard to tell what. It looks like almost like a human figure laying on its face, and these look like wings in kind of. Not sure. Anyway, moving on. That is the end of that chapter. Moving into chapter 5. The gods who loved women, the Nephilim, the genetic engineering of humankind, the fish gods, the original history of the origin of the species. All those bullet pointed parts of the title. So let's just jump straight on into it. We are now about to look into one of the murkier and most shameful episodes in the history of the world. Even within the secret societies, a veil is sometimes drawn. A priest in Babylon at the time of Alexander the Great was one of the first historians. It is clear from the few remaining fragments that Berosus, like Herodotus before him, had studied the king lists inscribed on temple walls and delved into the secret priestly archives. The few fragments of Berosus that survive contain teachings on the history of the origins of the earth and the sky and the race of hermaphrodites, the pre-sexual humans who reproduced by means of parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis. Berosus goes on to describe how the land came to be inhabited by a primitive race. Then one day a monster emerged on the seashore, an animal called Oannes. I'm not sure. Oannes. Quote, whose whole body was that of a fish. Under the fish's head he had another head with feet also below, similar to those of a man, subjoined to the fish's tail. His voice and language were articulate and human, and representation of him is preserved even to this day. End quote. Oh, and then right into another quote and another quote. So this one is, "This monster was accustomed to pass the day among men, but took no food then, and he gave them an insight into letters and sciences and arts of every kind. He taught them to construct cities, to found temples, to compile laws, and explained to them with principles of geometric knowledge, the principles of geometric knowledge. He made them distinguish the seeds of the earth and showed them how to collect fruits. In short, he instructed them in everything which could soften manners and humanize their lives." End quote. Then there's a third short quote. "And when the sun had set, this being, Oannes, retired again into the sea and passed the night in the sea, for he was amphibious." End quote. Okay, so then we have the Oannes 19th century engraving taken from the walls of Nineveh, original now in the British Museum. And this is also an illustration that was used by Zecharia Sitchin in his book, The 12th Planet. But he described this as a priest with a fish headdress. So here we go. And he also specifically pointed out this. This appears in many cultures across the world. It kind of looks like a small satchel or something that they're carrying, but it appears all over the world and throughout time. Okay, so another short quote. "After this appeared other animals like Oannes." End quote. Similar stories of fish gods who suddenly appear and become the teachers of mankind can be found in other traditions. For example, the Indian stories about Matsya, the first avatar of Vishnu, and the stories of the ancient Phoenicians of the Dagon, who taught humankind the art of irrigation, and the ancient fish gods of the Dagon tribe in West Africa. We even know that Plutarch that the earliest representations of Zeus were of a man with a fish tail, an image which survived in Greek mythology in the form of his brother Poseidon. Some modern writers outside the esoteric tradition have seen in this fish imagery evidence of an alien invasion in ancient times. It's even been suggested that the human race was genetically engineered by alien invaders, which is a good illustration of the way that esoteric traditions are misinterpreted by people trying to impose a materialistic interpretation on them. If our candidate for initiation had been initiated to a high enough level, he would have been taught the truth of the matter, something very like the following. And so, just, I think he's specifically referring to Zecharia Sitchin in that last paragraph there. In Genesis, there is a passage which may at first not seem to refer to exactly the same fishy events, though it is also about invasion by beings from another realm. Genesis 6:1 through 5, quote, "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took wives which they chose. When the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." End quote. What on earth are we to make of this passage? The phrase here translated as sons of God is elsewhere in the Bible a phrase used to mean angels, messengers coming down from heaven. But in this context, coming down also seems to carry with it moral opprobrium by saying that the angels had sex with women is Genesis perhaps saying that these angels lowered themselves to participate in the material world, and perhaps they had become too enamored with it. As I say, we are now trying to penetrate one of the murkier episodes in the secret history, and indeed these 5 verses in Genesis might well remain completely impenetrable, were it not for the fact that this episode is treated rather more fully in ancient Hebrew traditions, particularly the Book of Enoch. This book disappeared from mainstream exoteric history in AD 300 to 400, but traditions regarding its existence, its contents, and teachings were preserved in Freemasonry. Then, in 1773, some very tattered scripts of it were tracked down in Ethiopian monasteries by the Scottish explorer James Bruce, and in this way the old Freemasonic traditions were vindicated. Never part of the canon of Christian scripture as it was put together in the 4th century, the Book of Enoch was nevertheless sufficiently esteemed by writers of the New Testament for them to quote from it, evidently viewing it as an authority with a status something like sacred scripture. It is a measure of the status of this book that Jesus Christ evidently recognized its notions of a coming kingdom and the judgment of the world. Moreover, the phrase used at his transfiguration, quote, "This is my son, the elect one," end quote, is meant to show that Jesus Christ is the one promised by the Book of Enoch. This is what the Book of Enoch has to say about the angels who loved women. Quote, Enoch 6, 1 through 4, quote, "And it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters, and the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose ourselves wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one, and they began to go in unto them, and to defile themselves with them, and they taught them charms and enchantments, and they became pregnant." End quote. Later, Enoch is given a tour of the heavens where the rebel angels or watchers ask Enoch to intercede with God on their behalf. But when Enoch tries to do so, God only repudiates them, sending Enoch back. Quote, "And go say to the watchers who have sent thee to intercede for them, you should intercede for men and not men for you." End quote. The story of the rebellious angels is then retold, as it were, in God's own words, with additional details. In Enoch 6:15 through 16, quote, "Wherefore have ye left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like the children of the earth, and begotten giants as your sons? And though you were spiritual beings living the eternal life, you have defiled yourself with the blood of women, and have begotten children with the blood of flesh and blood, as those also who die and perish. And now as to the watchers who have sent thee to intercede for them, who have been aforetime in heaven, say to them," quote, no, this is still a quote. It's a quote within a quote, sorry. "You have been in heaven, but all the mysteries had not yet been revealed to you, and you knew worthless ones, and these in the hardness of your hearts you have made known to women, and through these mysteries of women and men work much evil on earth. Say to them, therefore, you have no peace." End quote. And that's the end of the Epistle of Jude 6:6 describes the watchers as having, quote, "not kept their own appointed habitations," end quote. A 3rd century Christian writer, Commodorius, wrote, quote, "The women who seduced the angels were of such lewdness that their seducers could not now desire to return to heaven." But beyond these few strange fragmentary hints lies a set of characters very familiar to us all. When the Epistle to Jude describes the Watchers as not having kept to their appointed seasons, it seems to be referring to them in some way as timekeepers, but the final telling clue to revealing the hidden identity of these fallen angels lies in their number, given in one of the versions of the Book of Enoch as 7. In all traditions, 7 is the number of the great gods of the solar system. Again, we see that the biblical narrative has encoded within it stories of the same astronomical gods as those of Greece and Rome. The angels who became sexually attracted to human women are none other than the gods of Olympus. We have seen that the Bible contains encoded within it an account of creation in which key roles have been played by Saturn, Earth, the Sun, Venus, and the Moon. We have followed the story from the purely material to the vegetable to the first stirrings of animal life. The age that followed would be marked by the arrival of the gods of the solar system. Jupiter, or Zeus, as he was known to the Greeks, became the king of all the gods. The gods of Mars and Mercury would fly into view during this age too. The infant Jupiter had to be hidden from his father, Saturn. Mother Earth kept Jupiter on the island of Crete in a cave deep underground. Isolated from the other gods, the boy Jupiter lived on the milk of a goat nymph and ate the honey of sacred bees. Mother Earth hid Jupiter in this cave because she was afraid that Saturn and the Titans, the elder sons and daughters of Saturn, would come to destroy him. She knew that the birth of Jupiter showed that the reign of Saturn was coming to an end, but the transition from one age to another is always a painful one. The old order always tries to stay on beyond its allotted time. The Titans were Saturn's enforcers. They were the consciousness eaters. They wanted to swallow up the new life and create what Milton, who knew all about the secret history, called, quote unquote, a universe of death. The Titans would always be enemies of Jupiter. They failed to kill him while he was still an infant, but they did not cease to wage war on him, sporadically and in great battles, until finally and decisively Jupiter defeated them and imprisoned them underground. There, these great forces of materialism became part of the very structure of the earth, and whenever volcanoes rumbled and threatened to erupt, the ancients heard their discontent. With the Titans imprisoned, Jupiter became for a while the undisputed ruler of Mount Olympus, king of the gods and god of a new age. He shook his magnificent locks, and the whole earth trembled. He was the only god strong enough to throw the thunderbolt. In his masterpiece, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony, the great Italian scholar and writer Roberto Calasso, who has done much to bring esoteric lore regarding the historical reality behind myths to a wider public, put it like this. Quote, Olympus is a rebellion of lightness against precision, end quote. In other words, the Olympic gods, Jupiter, Apollo, Mars, Mercury, Diana, Athena, and others, rebelled against the limitations imposed by Saturn. The Olympians flew through the air to perform magical deeds and defeat terrible monsters. It was a splendid, spectacular era that thrashes and writhes in the mind, inspiring some of history's most imaginative art, sculpture, and literature. But it was also somewhat sinister, an age charged with moral ambiguity. The thunderbolt of Jupiter struck through the dense fog of testosterone, the feral reek of animal passion, the fell heartlessness of animal ferocity. Jupiter raped Callisto, and she was turned into a bear. He raped Io, turned her into a cow. He punished like Lycaon? I'm going to say Lycaon, for cannibalism by turning him into a wolf. Apollo's lust for Hyacinth caused the beautiful youth to metamorphose into the flower, and his rape of Daphne ended in her morphing into the laurel bush. We should take note that all these myths are concerned with is the proliferation of natural forms, the cramming of every square inch of our planet with the almost infinite variety of plants and animals, the biodiversity that is its great natural glory. Zeus is not moral in a sense that Moses would have recognized, but he and his fellow Olympians direct the galvanizing fecundity with myriad creativity of the biological world. Okay. Um, and then we come to a picture. The caption is a long one again. Telemanes depicted being forced to hold up the earth in a 19th century engraving of recent discovery at Pompeii. The Telemanes were titans forced to become a part of the earth's structure. Their progeny were earth demons or goblins. As late as the 19th century, they were still feared in some remote rural regions in southern Europe. These red-eyed creatures, with skin made of scales like dead gray fingernails, were said to pursue you in spirit even after you had died. So, I'll show you that picture. Holding up the earth, apparently. Each one's a little different. Okay. But what of the story of the fish gods? How does that fit in? We have seen that many mythologies around the world tell the story of the arrival of the fish gods. We have touched on the fact that even Jupiter in his earliest representations was one of them. We have seen too that the myths of Jupiter and the other Olympian gods are an account of the proliferation of animal forms. Bringing these two things together gives rise to an astonishing possibility. Could it be that the ancient myths anticipated the modern scientific insight that the animal life that would eventually evolve into the human form began life as a fish? If this were true, it would be an astonishing revelation. Darwin's discovery of the evolution of the species is one of history's great scientific discoveries, ranked alongside Galileo's, Newton's, and Einstein's. Could it be that the priests of the mystery schools knew of the evolution of species many thousands of years earlier? We shall now discover how evidence for this claim, which may initially at least sound implausible, is written across the sky in blazing lights for all to see. We are cracking the code of the cosmos. We saw how the earliest episodes in history are to be understood in terms of the ordered creation of the solar system, one for the other, one after the other. Saturn, the Sun, Venus, the Moon, and Jupiter joined in the work of weaving together the basic conditions that made possible the evolution of life on Earth. Following this sequence has brought us to the dawn of animal life and of consciousness and the beginning of the proliferation of animal forms. In order to understand the history of the development of these animal forms, we must turn again to astronomy, and following on from the sequence in which the ancients believed that planets were created, we turn to an interlocking sequence, the constellations of the zodiac. Whew. To ancients, the forces of nature were asleep during winter and then reawakened, exerting their influence anew in the spring. The constellation in which the sun rose in the spring was therefore very important to them. The sun vivified that constellation, energizing it and increasing its power to shape the world and its history. Because of a slight wobble in the earth as it spins on its axis, the sun seems to us to fall slowly backwards against the backdrop of stars. Over a period of some 2,160 years, the sun rises in the same constellation. It then moves on to the next one. We are currently in the age of Pisces and famously awaiting the dawn of the age of Aquarius. As constellation follows constellation, the age and age follows age, the symphonic variations of the music of the spheres signal a new movement. The cycle of animating powers of instinctual drives sweeping through the cosmos moves on to a new plane. We think of the 12 constellations of the zodiac following in a sequence according to months of the year, Aries followed by Taurus, then Gemini, and so on. In the larger cycle, measured by the appearances of these constellations at the spring equinox, the constellations move backwards, quote unquote. Gemini is followed by Taurus, then Aries, and so on. This phenomenon is known as precession. There is some dispute among academics as to when the ancients first became aware of it. The breakthrough book on this subject was Hamlet's Mill, written by MIT professor and a history of the history and philosophy of science, Giorgio de Santillana, and Hertha von Dechend, professor of science at Frankfurt University and published in the late 1950s. Tremendously erudite, it began a process of rediscovering an astronomical dimension of myths that had long been forgotten outside the secret societies. Their thesis is that one of the stories central to all mythology, indeed all literature from Oedipus Rex to Hamlet, the story of the dispossessed son who defeats his uncle to regain his father's throne, is a description of an astronomical event, of one processional epoch succeeding another. But Hamlet's Mill provides an essentially static model. It shows that precession is encoded on one particular archetype, not how the succession of ruling constellation allows us to organize different layers of myth in their proper chronological sequence. Let us now look at this sequence in terms of the historical reality that lies behind the myths of Jupiter and the other gods according to esoteric tradition. Because we have been looking at history as it has been remembered in myths, particularly the myths of the gods of Olympus, we have naturally been picturing for ourselves anatomically modern humans. However, we should continue to bear in mind that these myths represent what these things would have looked like to the eye of the imagination. But to a physical eye, if any such had existed, it would all have looked very different. Because of what these imaginative pictures represent, because what these imaginative pictures represent is the beginning and development of primitive life forms. If the age of the first marine life was marked by the rulership of the planet Jupiter, then in terms of the precession of the constellations, it was marked by Pisces. When the sun first began to rise in the constellation of Pisces, a new form condensed out of the semi-liquid substance on the Earth's surface. This was the earliest embryonic form of the fish, somewhat like a modern jellyfish. The ancients conceived of this evolutionary impulse as a god. If primitive life on Earth, the life that would eventually evolve into human life, took on a primitive fish form, that was because a god took on this form and, as it were, pulled life. Wow, I just totally lost my place. Took on a primitive fish form that was because a god took on this form and, as it were, pulled life on Earth with him. Ugh. In Egypt, this miraculous event, the birth of human life, was known as the birth of Horus, and the earliest representations of Horus, like those of Jupiter, were half man, half fish. So we again see that the Greeks and Egyptians, like the Greeks and the Hebrews, worshiped the same god in different cultural clothing. The next precessional age was the first age of Aquarius. This was the era of the evolution of amphibians, giant floating creatures somewhat like the modern dolphins, but with webbed limbs and lantern-like foreheads. This lantern was the pineal gland. Protruding from the top, it still holds in some reptiles, such as the tuatara species of lizard from New Zealand. Okay, then we have a picture and a caption. The Lantern of Osiris, I've also heard it, is an ancient record of this late vegetable protuberance from the animal form. Okay, let me go ahead and bring that picture up. And it's a small one, so it's not going to be terribly clear, but there you go. All right. The lantern was still these proto human creatures' main organ of perception, sensitive to warmth and coolness in other living beings, both in the vicinity and in the distance. The lantern could intuit their inner nature. These proto humans could intuit, too, the nature of the plants, assessing their suitability as food or medicine in the way that some animals in the way that some animals can. And because the laws of natural growth were not yet completely fixed, humans would also could also speak to plants in a way which might, as the ancient sagas of the Jews have it, make, quote, a tree yield fruits or ears of wheat grow as tall as the cedars of Lebanon, end quote. We must imagine the speech made by these amphibian humans as sounding something like the bellow of a stag. Lantern-headed humans were later idealized as unicorns. The earth goddess still told them what to do clairvoyantly, so that the natural law and the moral law were the same thing. This historical truth is beautifully portrayed in the famous tapestry in the Musée de Cluny in Paris, where the unicorn lays its head in the lap of a virgin. Our collective memory of the unicorn is, of course, of a hunted creature. Humans might seek sanctuary in the lap of Mother Earth, but the world was becoming a dangerous place. We saw that desire had originally existed independently of humankind. The desires continued to exist independently, unintegrated into the proto-human form. These desires, running wild, were the dragons of mythology. They terrorized the rest of creation. As the harsh surface of the earth began to harden into something like dry land, the next stage of the development of human form began. This was the beginning of the age of Capricorn, when proto-humans developed calves and limbs to crawl onto land to pursue their burgeoning animal desires. According to the ancient wisdom, it was the arrival of Mars that led to the evolution of warm-blooded animals. Mars arrived at the time of the transition from the lizard-like amphibians of the age of Capricorn to the land animals of the age of four-footed Sagittarius. The iron of Mars yielded red blood and provided the conditions that would make egotism possible, and not only in the sense of a a healthy drive to survive. As the earth continued to harden and become denser and drier, it shrank further, and the result that one being could only prosper at another's expense, with the result, it became part of the human condition that I can hardly move without harming, even killing another living creature, because of Mars, there's also a cruel part of human nature that rejoices in this, exults in forcing a modern human being to submit, and experiences euphoria when it is dominant over others, when it is able to exercise willpower without restraint. Struggling here. One more paragraph, then we have a picture. As proto-humans became wholly land creatures, it also became necessary to create new ways for humans to communicate. It was as the result of the influence of Mercury that the thorax evolved. Mercury also fashioned leaner and fitter limbs, the better for humans to move towards each other and live and work together. He was, of course, the messenger and scribe of the gods, known as Hermes to the Greeks and Thoth to the Egyptians. He was also the god of tricks and thieving. And then we have the picture. I'll go ahead and blow it up here and show you. This is the Oriental zodiac, according to this. Which mm, the outer would be, sure. Um, no, this is not. It's not the Oriental one. This is the European one because there is no twins in the Chinese zodiac. Interesting. Anyway, moving on. And we have another picture right away, two pictures actually, and the caption is Zodiacs from Egypt, India, and Greece, showing an extraordinary similarity of imagery. So I will bring this one up. So yeah, what do we got here? There's a fish of some kind, scorpion, the archer, scales, so Libra. Yeah, it's recognizable. Okay, and then the next one seems a little easier to see to me. Um, there's Scorpio, Libra, Leo. Um, I'm completely blanking on the crab. Anyway, doesn't matter. Pisces, Taurus. Yeah. Okay. Moving right along. This chapter has been a commentary on Genesis, taking into account parallel traditions such as the Egyptian and the Greek. This way of interpreting or decoding the Bible surfaced among the Neoplatonists and early Kabbalists and was exposed by groups like the Rosicrucians. Much of what we have been considering can be found, for example, in the 17th century writings of Robert Flood, highly influential on Milton's Paradise Lost, and slightly later Jacob Boehm's commentary on Genesis, already mentioned Mysterium Magnum. The work of elucidating these commentaries and reframing the history the wisdom of the Rosicrucians in modern times was carried out by the great Austrian scholar and initiate Rudolf Steiner, whose anthropological society perhaps has the best claim to be a genuine survivor of the true Rosicrucian stream. However, even outside the esoteric tradition, it is acknowledged that the ancient civilizations around the world showed remarkable agreement when it came to the images associated with the sequence of the constellations of the zodiac. This agreement is all the more remarkable, you might think, when they consider how little the arrangements of the stars as seen from the surface of the earth suggest these images. The reality is that the ancients saw in this sequence of the constellations the history of the evolution of humanity and the world as it was collectively remembered and understood. For them, the history of the world was written in the stars. And we have another picture. Show you that real quick. kind of reminds me a little bit of. Oh, it's supposed to be Medusa, though, I think. Isn't it? Yeah, and I don't know. Anyway. Oh, duh. Here's the um, caption. It's a fairly long one. If I'd have just read it first, I would have known that yes, it is Medusa. So here it is. Quote, the head of the Medusa on a Greek gem. The night sky was a living history because the heavenly bodies were seen as the material bodies of spiritual beings or gods. The ancients believed they had the ability to communicate with these beings and felt their influence. For instance, it is no coincidence that the star Algol, associated with the head of the Gorgon Medusa in Greek tradition, was felt to be a magnificent influence in all the cultures of the ancient world. The Hebrew astrologers named it after the dark specter Lilith, and even before this, Hebrews of the desert had called it the head of Satan, while the Chinese named it by a phrase meaning piled up corpses. Diverse cultures were experiencing the same spiritual reality when they looked up at the same area of the sky. Wow, I'm glad we're almost done. I'm struggling here. I don't know why I'm getting so droopy. Therefore, what is generally regarded as a modern idea that put paid to ancient superstition is in fact itself an ancient idea. I think there's got to be a typo there. An understanding of the ordered evolution of the species originated thousands of years before Darwin set sail in the HMS Beagle. This secret history was encoded in the zodiac, written down by initiates such as Jacob Boehm and Robert Flood, and preserved into modern times by esoteric groups such as the Freemasons and various Rosicrucian groups, but always and very deliberately in a way that was hard for outsiders to understand. Then, in the 19th century, when the sacred texts of Hinduism were first translated into European languages and openly published, much esoteric knowledge, which had previously been carefully managed and controlled, now leaked into the public consciousness. Fascination with these ideas also led to a renewed interest in the Kabbalah and other Western traditions and helped fire the craze for spiritualism. Many of the great intellectuals of the period became interested in trying to apply scientific methodology to spiritual and spiritualist phenomena. In 1874, Charles Darwin attended seances with the novelist George Eliot. Darwin's rival A. E. Wallace took part in several controlled experiments into spiritualism, believing its phenomena would be measured and verified just as well as other types of phenomena were measured and verified by the other sciences. As we shall see later, many leading intellectuals, including scientists, believed that there was something in esoteric philosophy and that science and the supernatural would eventually come together. If you don't know who Wallace was, he was a rival in a manner of speaking. He wrote an almost identical um, theory of evolution to what Darwin did, only Darwin got to the publisher first. So that's why we know Darwin and we're not so familiar with Wallace. Friedrich Max Müller was a young German scholar employed by the East India Company in the 1840s to translate the Rig Veda. Before being awarded a professional chair at Oxford, he went on to translate the sacred books of the East in 50 volumes, making Oriental esoteric doctrines widely available for the first time. He was also very friendly with Darwin, with whom he kept up a regular correspondence. The Origin of Species was published in 1859. Um, the sacred books of the East are still available. If you, I have them in electronic format. They're also on sacredtext.com if you're interested in reading any of them. They are the only source I know of that the entirety of the Upanishads are translated. Otherwise, you just get excerpts from them. So, just so you know. So we've got just a little over a page and a half here. In the secret history of evolution of the species, in the secret history, the evolution of the species was not the even progress that science supposes. There were twists and turns that have important implications for the way we understand our own physiology and mental makeup. There were dead ends, false starts, and even deliberate attempts at sabotage. Snakes, spiders, beetles, and parasitic creatures, on the other hand, were formed under the malignant influence of dark side of the moon. According to the secret doctrine, the animals we know today evolved into the forms we are familiar with today, influenced by the stars and planets. Lions by the constellation of Leo, for instance, bulls by the constellation of Taurus, centaurs, mermaids, sirens, fauns, and satyrs were predecessors of anatomically modern humans, representing the impulse to create anatomically modern humans in various transitional stages. The cosmic plan was that all the world's biological forms would gradually be incorporated into humankind, which was intended to be the crown of all creation. As the gods led humanity closer and closer to human anatomy as we know it, they assumed the part animal, part human forms remembered by the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Persians, and the Babylonians, until they finally assumed anatomically perfect forms remembered by the last great civilizations of the ancient world, the Greeks and Romans. For example, the goddess of the planet Venus was cow-headed Hathor, and the god of the planet Mercury was dog-headed Anubis on the walls of Egyptian temples. According to the secret tradition, these same gods, the same living ones, were remembered by the classic Greeks in a later, more evolved form. The ancient texts describing this era also lay great emphasis on its giants. The author of the Book of Enoch, writing in the Hebrew tradition, and Plato, writing in the Greek tradition, agree that in these early pre-flood times there arose a race of giants. In fact, traditions of an antediluvian race of giants can be found all over the world, from the Danavas and Daityas of India to the Miaotze of China. In a dialogue between and this is a title, a dialogue between Midas the Phrygian and Silenus that has survived in fragmentary form from the time of Alexander the Great, Silenus says that, quote, men grew to double the size of the tallest men in his time, and they lived to twice the age, end quote. In the secret tradition, the gigantic Bamyan statues recently destroyed in Afghanistan were not three giant statues of Buddhas, but three life-size statues of giants of 173, 120, and 30 feet high. The drapery that made them look like Buddhas was made of plaster, said to have been added to the stone later. In the 19th century, it was recorded that the locals believed them to be statues of the Miaotze, the giants of Chinese tradition. The famous statues of Easter Island are also supposed to record the real heights of historical giants. Then there was the dead-end freaks, the one-legged men, the bat-men, the insect men, and the men with tails. Manetho, an ancient historian of the 3rd century BC, also recorded traditions of the progeny of the Watchers, writing, quote, they brought double-winged human beings, also others with 4 wings and 2 faces, human beings with 1 body and 2 heads, still other human beings had thighs of goats and horns upon their heads. Others had the feet of horses behind and men in front. There were also others said to have been man-headed bulls and four-headed dogs, whose tails emerged like fish tails from their backs, and other monsters such as all kinds of dragon-like beings. This, then, is the era remembered in the great myths and finds echoes in great fantasy literature such as J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings or the Narnia books of C.S. Lewis. This fantasy literature represents a welling up into the present of a collective memory of this period when humans lived on the earth with giants, dragons, mermaids, centaurs, unicorns, fauns, satyrs, legions of dwarves, sylphs, nymphs, dryads, and other lesser spiritual beings served the gods and humans, rubbed shoulders with them, fought battles with them, and sometimes fell in love with them. In the secret history, the last creatures to incarnate before humans were the apes. They came about because some human spirits rushed into an incarnation too early, before human anatomy had been perfected. In the first history, therefore, it is not right to say that humans are descended from apes, rather that apes represent a degeneration of humankind. Of course, none of the fabulous creatures have left any trace in the fossil record, so why have the great men and women of history who were initiates of the secret societies believed in them? Why should any intelligent person even begin to toy with the idea? End chapter. And none too soon. All right. So the next chapter, which I will definitely not be getting into tonight, is the assassination of the Green King, Isis and Osiris, the Cave of the Skull, and the Palladium. We will get to that next time, probably Tuesday. So let's see who's around to raid. Boy, there's a bunch of people on tonight. Mr. Blitzer's on. He's playing Days Gone, which is a great game. Let's go on over there. I will take us there. Just bear with me. Give him a minute or two of your time, and I'll see you there.
Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not nights like I've had, but more sophisticated into the